This episode is sponsored by Magic Mind and Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast. This episode is titled Stop Using Frameworks for Everything, Vanilla JavaScript in 2025. So this is kind of falling into my, I don't know what we would call it, a series of episodes, but I'm kind of doing a series on the three pillars, and I'm covering some different stuff. Like in HTML, I was covering stuff like semantic HTML and much more. You can go check out that episode. For CSS, it hasn't come out yet, but I was covering, I think it was some best practices, like not being too specific with your selectors as one example. Again, these episodes are much larger than just one topic. And then in this episode, I actually had a whole bunch of different topics laid out, but I decided to zoom in on vanilla JavaScript because it's something that I actually use quite a bit professionally. And I think that a lot of people think like, hey, those days are gone. And with Mike's episode, I don't know, because the episode release order is kind of jumbled up right now, but last week or so, Mike actually had mentioned, we were discussing the State of JavaScript survey from 2024, and we were discussing, kind of the complexities of JavaScript and how many layers there are to learn now, and, the list goes on. And I kind of thought to myself, vanilla JavaScript is kind of getting covered up by frameworks and stuff, rightfully so, but not always. And so in this episode, I'm going to talk about the times in which it makes sense, even in 2025 and even professionally, to use vanilla JavaScript. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go and check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And so, why vanilla JavaScript? So vanilla JavaScript, to just sort of give like a really brief introduction, is vanilla JavaScript is kind of like, when I was saying like, hey, like, don't keep handing all the styling stuff to JavaScript. Use CSS instead. The same vibe, not the same concept, but the same vibe exists here, where it's like, hey, sometimes you don't need to pull in a framework. Sometimes you don't need to call for help. You're calling a friend for help with something like a framework. What you really want to do is just use vanilla JavaScript, and that's sometimes called the platform or the native platform. And what that means is the actual browser itself, assuming it's modern and has JavaScript turned on, of course, it allows you to run, a very modern version of JavaScript right in the browser. You can even run some JavaScript in the debug tools, in the dev tools, and you can play with stuff. Like you could play with stuff in the console as well. You can actually use that as an input in the dev tools of a browser, and you can mess with stuff like that. So that's the kind of the vibe we're getting here, is that we're trying to get kind of close to the metal. We're trying to get close to the browser. We don't want to fluff up our app. Much like how with CSS taking over the styling, we want CSS to take over as much styling as possible and leave that interactivity to JavaScript. In JavaScript, we would, sometimes you don't want to call upon a framework to ease the syntax or make things more interactive than they need to be in certain contexts. And I'm going to talk about those contexts here today. And I have several examples as to what we're actually potentially, or I guess certain projects and things like that, where vanilla JavaScript is still very, very relevant.
I think just before we dive too far in, I think there's always going to be value to vanilla JavaScript, but I do, and I will play a little bit of devil's advocate as we go through, trying to not promote you to get to a framework or get to a bundler or whatever, but throwing in some examples of maybe where a bundler and where a framework do make some of these things a little bit easier and a little bit better in today's JavaScript world. Like the reason that Matt brought up that survey that we talked about is that in that survey, it showed that Most people are now starting to use compiled JavaScript, which is not going to be a vanilla JavaScript. It means that they're using something like TypeScript, compiling it into vanilla JavaScript. And there's a good reason for that. But I think a lot of what we cover in this episode is the reasons where you would want to use vanilla JavaScript. And there's still some valid ones for sure. And there's also like some abstract reasons of why you would want to use it, which I think, again, Matt will get into. But overall, I wouldn't fully recommend being like only use vanilla JavaScript if you're doing like a big production website, or if you're doing it like, just for the sake of using it. If you're doing something that requires reactivity, lean into the tool that helps you do that easier. But if you're doing something smaller, or what Matt's going to mention in a second, lean into vanilla JavaScript, learn it. It's an awesome tool.
And one thing to be clear is that this isn't vanilla JavaScript on the back end or anything crazy. This is vanilla JavaScript in its most sort of default form, which is like on the front end, messing with the DOM, passing some data around, processing some data. This isn't some like high class, like, hey, use vanilla JavaScript, but use it on the server. Like, we're not talking about that. We're talking about using JavaScript sort of not necessarily inline, but, hopefully you know what I'm trying to get at, to manipulate the actual DOM to add that interactivity layer. So small projects is the very first thing on the ticket for today. Small projects generally don't need the complexity and features that frameworks bring. A lot of modern frameworks bring is a lot of sort of dynamic data handling, where things happen like, I click this plus button and then the number that's listed within a paragraph or something like that goes up, and it keeps going up or down depending on if I'm pressing a plus or a negative button. A lot of small projects don't generally need that. And a lot of code bases that kind of demand a framework are usually large. They're usually complex, partially due to the fact that they're large. And what happens is people then, usually the dev team, call for consistent code formatting and consistent code methodologies to help manage this sort of behemoth of a code base. This is typically done through linting, right? Linters will have different rules in there and different things, and each team can make their own different lint rules. And we have an episode that talks about that as well. But we're talking about a small project here, so we don't need a framework to come in here and help us manage the code base. The code base might be 3 files and 200 lines among all of them. And that includes the CSS, that includes the HTML, that includes the JS. Some of these projects are very small. Also, so you might say, well, some of these projects, they might scale, right? You might be like, yeah, but I started small and then it scaled, and I should have got it started off on the right foot. I should have used a framework out of the gate. Not necessarily true. Not only are small projects typically easy to replace, such as a landing page where, maybe you do want to use the same code base, but it's just a landing page. So if I delete all my code and then kind of quote unquote start from scratch as the site scales up and I start like kind of coding a brand new site, I mean, fair enough, right? Like that's not too much work lost. But also some projects are actually specifically designed to be small. They're not small because of consequence. They're designed to be small. And that's because they may have specific requirements, such as the budget may be super low. You may need just cheap shared hosting with just a little bit of storage. And you might think at that point as well, you might say, well, like storage is pretty cheap, hosting's pretty cheap, but we're talking in like American and Canadian dollars generally, and UK pounds and things like that, sure. But there's going to be some countries where their currency doesn't go as far, and if they need to have an American host for their project, cheap hosting may be an absolute necessity. And so there's going to be specific reasons why you may want to keep a project small. Now, some common examples of small projects, at least the ones that I'm talking about, include landing pages, which I've already mentioned, but also things like single-purpose widgets or site components. The thing I'm thinking of when I say that is something like, you have an event going on, like a physical event going on, and you want this one web page for some reason to just be a quick and dirty slider. Instead of installing a slider, you may just have, your JavaScript move some pages around in a carousel like thing, and it's just going to run in the background of an event, like on the projector in between PowerPoint presentations or something. That's a single purpose widget. That's a single purpose little site component. So you don't really need to have you don't really need to have like a framework because it's a pretty small project. And also small static websites as well. And I want to emphasize small because static websites can get big. There's obviously frameworks and tooling that can take big projects that are built with frameworks and plugins and tools and all kinds of things and make them static for performance reasons. But some static websites are literally just small, maybe, kind of your standard 5-page small business website or something like that. I mean, our website for our agency, I built that thing probably 10 years ago now, maybe even longer. And it's a small static website that uses absolutely no frameworks. And obviously frameworks were less popular back then, but the site's still up today and still brings us the occasional lead, albeit we don't track that necessarily, but we do have some people that say like, oh, I checked out your site and I'm talking to you now. But again, like that's something that we're still using professionally. Now, I do want to say one thing, that small projects are a little few and far between when it comes to professional kind of work. It's something where a lot of people now are tech savvy enough to go to a site builder of some sort and just kind of get a quick template, maybe a drag and drop builder of some sort, maybe get an Elementor spun up or something with the Elementor hosting itself, or maybe WordPress hosting and things like that. So small projects aren't really necessarily going to be the thing that brings you a lot of money professionally, but small projects are absolutely a reason to use vanilla JavaScript. Why would you have a site that's like 10 kilobytes and then you like call on some other framework, you bring it in, and the framework is 230 kilobytes? Like, I understand we're talking about kilobytes here, not even megabytes, but we're still talking about from 10 kilobytes to 230 kilobytes. It's well over a 10x size increase. Why bother when you could just have a couple lines of vanilla JavaScript?
So I agree with this, but I will play a little bit of devil's advocate, where in certain situations, and familiarity being probably the main situation, if you get good at using a framework and you need to build a small project really quickly, I wouldn't go out of your way to build that project in pure JavaScript when you can do it faster in a framework. And like for me, for example, I'm faster in SvelteKit. The fact that I understand it's how it fundamentally creates the scaffolding for me. I'm faster at building a small project in SvelteKit than I would be doing the same exact project, even if it is very, very small, with vanilla JavaScript. Now, the same thing applies the other way. If you're better with vanilla JavaScript and you're building a small project, I wouldn't reach for a framework at that point too. So again, the familiarity aspect does mean a lot here. And the other aspect and the other caveat I would put out is, if you're trying to learn a framework to get a job, for instance, that's another reason why you would probably go away from using vanilla JavaScript to a framework, even for a small project. But other than that, again, JavaScript does its thing perfectly well for any of the stuff that Matt was just mentioning.
You mentioned a really good point right off the hop, which is good. And that is that all these examples I'm going to lay out, small projects, and the next one's going to be performance critical sites. None of these examples and reasons for vanilla JavaScript, none of these things are airtight and perfect. Mm-hmm. There's going to be nuances, like Mike already mentioned, where you're like, hey, I should use a framework here, or hey, I shouldn't even use web dev technology for this. I might use something else completely, like totally reasonable. These are just examples where like it makes sense to use vanilla JavaScript, but it is not the only option. There's thousands of types of websites out there with tons of different restrictions. And some of them are web apps, some of them are kiosk apps, some of them have been ported from a website to a mobile app. There's so many different ways to use, bundle, and publish our work that there's no way that these examples are going to be super airtight. So if you are using a framework for your small website, and it was because you were learning, that doesn't mean go and tear that down. And then it's like, oh, this is a small project. Matt said to use vanilla JavaScript. Absolutely not. Like Mike, you raised a good point early on, which is good, because I think I wanted to actually mention that earlier in the episode and failed to do so. So the next example here is going to be performance critical websites. So performance critical websites, I'm talking like really, really granular things where you may need like really specific performance based upon network, based upon what's being shown. So think about stuff like, for example, you may have a website that's a financial thing. Maybe it's like some sort of stock ticker or something like that. And let's just say you are using a framework and the framework is delaying the upgrade or the update of a stock ticker by, 5 seconds for some reason. Unfortunately, frameworks use methodologies that may not be the most performant. Frameworks are tools that are general. They're general tools. And so they may not be able to use the most performant thing because they need to appeal to the majority of use cases. And so they may have to choose a bit of a middle ground there. But you trying to update your stock ticker, you don't really have that luxury. So some projects will have, to the second, maybe even to the millisecond concerns with performance. And this is difficult to manage because frameworks, like I said, may not use the most performant methodology, but frameworks also abstract away what they're doing. That's the point of a framework. They're abstracting that layer away. So you might go, man, I am calling this thing. It is cached. It's this, it's that. Why the heck is it taking me 5 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second when it needs to be as instant as possible? You don't know what that framework's doing in the background, right? And here's the thing. You may say, well, you know what? I'll run a bunch of tests. I'll do a bunch of things and I'll use that framework I'll learn the timing of the framework. I'll learn, okay, this is 5 seconds and I will compensate for that. I will make sure there's a thing that says updated every 5 seconds or something like that. Great. Today it's 5 seconds, but frameworks update. Frameworks, you do an upgrade on there, all of a sudden, all your numbers that you did, like you did real world testing and you determined it takes 5 seconds for this ticker to upgrade or to update, and all of a sudden you're in trouble now. Because it now may take 6. It may take 3 now. It may take 2. It may take 5 today, 4 tomorrow, and 7 the next day. You don't know. So you would have to continually run all these tests. Now, this is not me saying the vanilla JavaScript is perfect. It's not perfectly performant. You can totally make it not performant, right? Maybe you're going to have to look at a completely different technology here than web development or JavaScript. Maybe you're going to have to leverage some server stuff. If you're really looking at to the second things, functions and things like that. However, vanilla JavaScript gives you the close to the metal experience with the browser, as we've already mentioned in this episode, that allows you to tinker with the things that are right up against the metal. You're not like, hey, I want to use this method or this API. You're just doing that right away, right on JavaScript. You're not like, oh, I'll use, React's version of doing this. I'll use Sveilt's version of doing this. And maybe it's going through 5 functions when you could cut it down to one quick function just by calling on the API or using the method that vanilla JavaScript has built in under the hood right away. Maybe that's going to solve it. So you have more flexibility here, and you're so close to the metal, you're so close to the browser that you may solve your performance problem. And so performance critical sites are absolutely a place where vanilla JavaScript have a place in 2025, even professionally. Now, these are going to be rather niche, right? Many even investing websites will have a thing that says our tickers are updated every so often and whatever. But again, there are so many different use cases for our work that there may be something like a real-time dashboard is one example, where someone's like, I need this real-time dashboard to be to the half a second for whatever reason. There's people that invest at, God knows how fast, more than if you're a long-term investor for retirement, you just kind of go in and buy whatever you're buying. There's some people that buy, sell, and up, down, left, right, center. They're doing all kinds of crazy things. And if something is a 5% difference than what they thought, that's a major problem. And other reasons would be a real-time dashboard for checking the uptime of stuff that's immensely critical. Like, what if you had something that is, 10 minutes or not 10 minutes, but 10 or 15 seconds delayed and it's medical equipment? Like, that could be serious. So vanilla JavaScript may be an answer. It's probably not the only answer if you're making an app like this, but it is absolutely an answer to potentially some of these problems. Now, sites might also be run on underpowered hardware. So to kind of take it out of the super niche and kind of bring it into the regular niche, Mike and I have worked on websites where they're used under specific conditions, meaning they're open to the public, but they're primarily going to be used by particular people. In this case, they were going to be used by auto body techs, and auto body techs don't have the most powerful computers. Like, that's not their job. Like, they're buying new paint nozzles and wrenches and, whatever else, paint and all kinds of stuff for building, fixing, and repairing other, like, their cars, maintaining cars' auto body. The thing here is that their computers are going to fall by the wayside, maybe 10, 11 years old. So they want to be able to quickly see stuff. This is performance critical in that it doesn't need to be to the millisecond, but they don't want to be sitting there for 10 minutes while a site loads, or it loads in and then like the font isn't there and they scroll down to the part they want, then it janks back and scrolls back up for them and they're struggling with it. You don't want that. So that's performance critical in a kind of more realistic way. And then also we had another one. It was related to this project, but we had people that were straight up still on dial-up, 56K. I think they were remotely located up in northern Canada somewhere. If memory serves, it's been a long time, so it may not. However, we still needed to provide them with a resource that had a lot of information, and they needed to access it within a reasonable amount of time. So that means that one image that you accidentally forgot to compress at its 2 megabytes, which is lunacy, is going to be like potentially several minutes for this person, because dial-up's not going to have, the perfect 56K the whole time. And 56K, which is the speed, if you don't know, 56K is also, extremely slow to begin with. And so this is an example of a performance critical website where you need to be very mindful and say, okay, we need to have these images load lazily. Maybe we don't even need these images. Like, maybe we shouldn't have these images on this page. And the people who are using the dial-up will tell them, hey, don't go to the landing page because there's a bit of marketing there. Go right here to this like data table, which is just text and a bit of layout stuff in order for you to get the information you need. And then maybe it'll load in a minute instead of 10 or 5 or whatever it takes for that very slow and usually sketchy connection way up north to actually do it, to actually load through. Now, we mentioned, some niche sites here, performance critical sites. There's some niche things, like I said, stock tickers and things like that. And it leads us to our next example, which is going to be fine control projects. So this is now zooming in on that idea where it's like, hey, I need, to the second, to the millisecond controls. This is related to that in that there are going to be times when you make a project that is going to be really restrictive. Mike and I have experienced this where we've designed things such as kiosk apps using websites, wrapping them, where it's like, this is going to be on a specific device. This is going to be running all the time. It has to use this browser version. It has to use this web view version. This is going to be on Android. This is going to be on iOS. This will never be on Android. This will never be on iOS. This will be this. This will be that. So now the hardware comes into account. And with web development, usually you try to kind of generalize, right? You're making a website, like a tech blog, and you don't want only the people that have like Samsung phones to be able to access the tech blog. That's ridiculous. You want as many people as possible to click there because typically you're selling ads. But that's not what we're doing here. So these are a niche thing that does absolutely come up. Fine control projects. Another example would be if you make a website and you want to have a mobile app, the more affordable way to do it sometimes is to wrap that web app as a mobile app and ship it using something maybe like Apache Cordova or many other technologies. I think Electron is one that's used for the desktop, for example, things like that. And now you need to look at your restrictions. Like, you need to take a look and go, okay, like, will this work on Windows? Like, the operating system makes sense now. Will this work on Android? Will this work on Android, but only on Samsung Internet, which is Samsung's internet browser? Well, that's not good. Hang on. We have a glitch here where it's going to mess with Chrome. Oh, well, what about Edge on mobile? Like, there's going to be more things for you to take a look at because I believe, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong here, you can actually select, not always, but sometimes you can select what web view your site uses, or is that mostly in-app browser? I can't remember on Android.
No, you can't really select what browser. Like, I mean, you might have some selection, but for the most part, it's tied to whatever is available on the operating system that you're using. So each operating system on Android and iOS, for that matter, have their own version of WebView, and that will get updated with the operating system rather than with the browser. At least that's how it was when we were building. It could be different now, like it could be decoupled. It's very possible, but that's how when we were building these things, it was tied directly to the Android version. So like if your Android version was 7, you would have access to a certain subset of features that you wouldn't have access to in 6. And if you're, 8 would give you more features based on whatever Chrome version it was using. So that was a complicated thing that we had to kind of deal with for sure, that managing those web views and figuring out the feature set between them.
Well, I mean, that's even a good example, like whether or not you can select your web view on your device or whatever. Because I know that I've noticed that I use Edge on mobile, and like some of my in-app browsers on social media will be like, oh, this is Edge, and it'll like say like open in Edge if I click the overflow menu. But then I have an Android tablet, and even though I set Edge as the default, it'll be like, oh, this opened in Chrome, and like you need to like do the initial setup of Chrome to get this like in-app browser thing to work. And then there's also the web view thing in the background. And again, the reason why I'm mentioning all this is these are fine control things. You need to know this stuff, like Mike said. Android 7, you have a specific web view version, and that's what we're using. These devices are not going to be updated until next year or something like that. That's what we're using. And this leads me perfectly into my example. Let's say you produce a web app and it needs to be deployed to browsers that specifically have an older browser version or an older web view version, and what we're talking about here. And that older version has a specific bug that makes the display property not work properly when it is adjusted by JavaScript. So now, if we think about it, we go, well, if I use a framework, likely the show and hide feature of the framework is going to use display. It's going to manipulate the CSS property display. And since this is JavaScript, it ain't going to work correctly. However, with vanilla JavaScript, you can fine tune around this issue. You can go in and say, all right, my show and hide that I made is going to use the visibility property or the opacity property, or, we're going to work around this issue. Obviously, you should be using the display property. It makes sense, but we're talking about a problem here that we need to work around. Whereas your framework, again, it's a general tool. They're not going to be like, hey, this is a show and hide workaround. Like, why would they have a bunch of workarounds for random browser versions? That's not the case. So these fine control projects are one reason why you may use vanilla JavaScript. Another one is actually a bit more complex, and that would be creating some sort of drag and drop interface. Let's say the page is just loaded with elements, which adds to the performance problem. And let's just say for this particular project, you need it to be high performance. So you got something fighting against you. You got those extra elements. But let's also say that this is a really fine-tuned app, and you need a bunch of parameters taken into consideration, such as, oh, if I click and drag this element, it can only be dragged within this specific region of the page, and it can only be dragged on the x-axis or something like that. Utilizing vanilla JavaScript, you can directly interact with something like the drag and drop API, use pointer events directly, use touch events as needed in order to easily track the position of where elements should be dragged and implement different restrictions to allow those parameters that I just mentioned, such as being dragged only in a certain region. It allows you to quickly kind of like set up those regions, or not, I shouldn't say quickly, but allows you to set up those regions and things like that without having to go through a framework. Like a framework doesn't necessarily, some may, but frameworks don't necessarily have all these things already for you. And this is a particular use case where I need high performance in a page that's going to be performance challenged. It's like, well, maybe I should go as close to the metal as possible and utilize something like vanilla JavaScript.
I think you brought up a really good point early on when you said that frameworks like to abstract things away. And that's where I see this fine control point being made the most. When you need to know exactly, and I mean exactly to the T, what is happening on every aspect of your web app, whether it be because of a certain device, whether it be because of a certain requirement of your application, whatever, that's an indicator for you that you can't use a general purpose product like a framework. Frameworks are built to help the 99% of people rather than the very specific use case of the 1% that might not fit into the 99%, where you, in that 1%, have to now fight the framework. And if you've used a framework long enough, and if you've built a complicated enough application in a framework, you'll know what I mean by that 1% of fighting a framework, because it just happens naturally where you're like, I need to integrate this and this and this, and all of a sudden the framework just doesn't work that way, right? Now you're hacking a way into the framework to figure out a way to kind of bring it in. And that happens. It's fine. If you fit into that 99% anyway, for the most part, you're already benefiting from it. But if your application is so specific that you think you're not going to fit into that 99% right off the bat, it's important to make that realization earlier on and go away from using abstraction layers and start to use as close to exactly what you're writing is going to what's going to happen on screen as possible, which in this particular case of web development is JavaScript. And then you can be extrapolated into any other technology, obviously, like, if you want to go down to the hardware level, use C or assembly even, or sometimes even binary, depending on what you're doing. So like, it does work that way with web development, just like with all the other languages. So it's important to make that realization. I think it does take a little bit of time and experience to understand when you're going to need that fine control. But regardless, it's good to know that it exists, right? Like if you need that fine control, JavaScript is the way.
And I just want to make actually a point, like with all the things that you've discussed, all the things that I've discussed here, you can hear there's a lot of parameters. Obviously, we're talking about fine control here. And it comes down to like the professional angle here, which is like, okay, you may say, well, fine control sounds like a niche. Like, why would I learn this? I get it. But all these parameters that Mike and I are discussing here, I mean, if you're going to join a team that has a really restrictive work environment, meaning a technically restrictive work environment that's really difficult to work in and stuff like that, because the app that you're making is like really restrictive and really difficult to make. Again, I'm not talking from the HR perspective, talking from the JS perspective. The point is here is you can get paid pretty good. Like being able to be versatile and say, yeah, I don't need to use React. I'll use vanilla JS here and work around this issue. I'll use vanilla JS here and do that. And other technologies as well. Obviously, the topic of today is vanilla JS and also running over people's toes with computer chairs. But the point of the matter here is like Mike and I were employed for, a fair bit of time, got paid really well for being able to marry not only our IT at the time, because we were also deploying these apps over to different kiosks remotely and things like that, but also like we're making these apps and they're like, it's extremely restrictive. Like specific devices, specific browsers, specific web views, weird bugs, taking battery life into account. Like fine control projects are niche. And therefore you may get paid a fair bit for it. Not guaranteed, but it's absolutely a thing. And we've done it 100%. And for years too, we did it. Now, one thing I've also been struggling with for years is, of course, being in the holiday blues. And you get back from the holidays and it's like, man, and the new year is still like kind of fresh. I mean, it is. I mean, I just called it the new year, and it's kind of one of those things where it's like, my mental well-being, my mental health is kind of really taking a hit here. Like I'm off of holidays, I'm back to working, back to the grind, whatever. And last time I discussed this, which is the thing I'm discussing here, is of course Magic Mind. I was talking about how I was getting out of that holiday routine of being like, okay, get up late, kind of like lazily laze around the house, play some video games, drink a bunch of coffee, eat a bunch of sweets, and eat a bunch of like stuff you shouldn't be eating necessarily if you're worried about health and things like that. And I got out of my routine, and then I wanted to use Magic Mind, use my mental performance shot to get back into that routine. And that's exactly what I've been doing. And I've been improving my mental wealth and my mental health, at least in my mind. I'm getting back to it. I'm no longer being like, oh, like, why am I not on vacation anymore? Why is this and that? Getting back into the routine. And of course, I'm not saying Magic Mind got me back into the routine, but it's a key part of my routine. I'm no longer downing coffee all day. Again, I'm fighting off that constant, like, hey, I'll just have a coffee. Don't need to have that. Hey, it's the evening and I want like a little bit of an energy boost. Maybe I'm doing a little bit of work. Again, sometimes I'll have a Magic Mind in the evening if I think that's going to happen, rather than a coffee that sometimes keeps me awake at night. And speaking about being kept awake at night, we have a special offer for a bundle. So Magic Mind doesn't just have the mental performance shot, which has the time released caffeine and helps you have less stress, less jitters, as I say, helps you with your focus, helps you with your sharper mind, have a sharper mind. But they also have a new thing called Magic Mind Sleep here. And basically, it helps you kind of wind down at the end of the night. Basically, it's like, hey, I'm ready to go to sleep. Let's kind of maybe wind down with a Magic Mind Sleep. And we have a bundle available for you. There's a bundle that includes both Magic Mind, the mental performance shot, and Magic Mind Sleep. And you can get up to 45% off this Magic Mind bundle with my link, magicmind.com/HTMLpodbjan. And I'm going to spell that out. So magicmind.com/HTMLPodbjan. That, of course, will be in the show notes as well as in the show description. So you can check it out on your feed if you're using a podcast app that supports hyperlinks, or you can go on over to htmlallthethings.com and find the link there as well in the show notes, and you can grab your own. Again, up to 45% off this Magic Mind bundle. Give it a try. Get that mental performance shot for when you're like, you got to be ready to go and you're trying to fight off that caffeine and you don't want to have the jitters. And then sometimes you're just like, you know what? Okay, like I want to wind down at night. Let's kind of raise my mental wealth, raise my mental health, and try to get a little, like, hopefully kind of get back into the routine after the holidays. Again, for the first time, it's called the 24 Hours Pack, Focus and Sleep Shots bundled together. Go and check it out. And so now we're going to talk about learning and debugging. So JavaScript is one of the three pillars. We mention the three pillars all the time. I'll mention it one more time. The three pillars are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And when we say that, we're talking about them in their vanilla form. And that's no different here. Obviously, we're talking about vanilla JavaScript here today. And of course, vanilla JavaScript, the reason why we say like, hey, it's one of the pillars, it's one of the things you should learn, is it actually shows off programming, and I mean general programming, as well as JS or JavaScript specific fundamentals rather well. So if we think about it, frameworks are abstracting. Mike's mentioned it today. I've mentioned it a few times today. Frameworks abstract things away from you. And so therefore, frameworks have a proprietary syntax. This proprietary syntax is not a standard proprietary syntax. It varies from framework to framework. Therefore, if you went from one job and you're using React and you've never used Svelte and all of a sudden you want to use Svelte, it's like, I got to learn something new. Now, obviously, you're going to have some more experience and things like that. And you're going to be able to transition a little easier. You're going to be more familiar with this. However, Vanilla.js is the native platform, right? It's the platform, meaning the web. It's on the browser. It's ready to go as long as it's toggled on. And you're in a modern browser. And so you're able to use all these modern and powerful features of the native platform, which is vanilla JavaScript. So if you learn vanilla JavaScript, one of the pillars, not only are you getting exposure to, again, these JS fundamentals, but also programming fundamentals if you've never programmed before, but you're also learning something that can go with you anywhere. So let's just say, for example, you're working for a company that uses React, and then all of a sudden you want to go and work for a company that uses Svelte. Well, there might be a bit of a spin up time there, but let's just say they have a really quick, problem that comes up and you got to fix it really quick. Well, they don't have React. They don't have the whole dev environment set up. They don't have all that stuff. But you can go in there with a quick little bit of JavaScript and hide that heading that doesn't need to be there. Change that color that doesn't need to be red. It's supposed to be green or something. You have the power to do that with vanilla JavaScript because you understand the native platform. You understand how the browser is going to interpret things. And so that is an extremely useful skill. And also having been exposed to all the programming fundamentals, or at least a lot of them, because there's a heck of a lot, so you're not going to learn everything all at once, but having exposure to those programming fundamentals, as well as specific JavaScript fundamentals, you are then going to be, at least in my opinion, better off learning. You're like, learn JavaScript. Okay, now I'll learn Svelte. And then, okay, now I'll learn React. Instead of you learning something proprietary, you're learning something that at the end of the day, and like, correct me if I'm wrong, Mike, like absolutely everything that you make in say like Svelte/SvelteKit, when it compiles, it has to go back down to JavaScript anyway, because the platform only understands JavaScript anyway. So, I mean, learning the default language is perfect. Think about it like the way I kind of almost think about it is like using Google Translate's fantastic. You can go to another country and understand the language and talk. What happens if your phone dies? It'd be pretty nice if you just literally could talk to the person in their native language and get directions, ask where you are, talk, like just chat. That'd be pretty nice. And so like having having the tool, having Google Translate, fantastic. What if it's not there? So that's the kind of the way that I envision this, is learn that native platform, because it's the language of interactivity on the web, especially when it comes to manipulating the DOM. And of course, with other tools, the back end and things like that, but that's not the topic of today.
I think honestly, it's a very good point. And even though like I wouldn't say it's a full-on requirement to know the intricacies of JavaScript to learn a framework, The reason that we kind of push this 3-pillar mentality throughout the start of the podcast to the end of the podcast now, which has been like, how many years? 6 years or something stupid like that. The reason that we've been pushing it this hard is because when you understand what's happening and when you've done all the things that frameworks do for you by using vanilla JavaScript, the understanding of the separation of where a framework is and where JavaScript is and how to make a framework better and being able to troubleshoot, again, the whole debugging aspect of it is exponentially increased. Now, you can learn it. Like, yes, a lot of people these days, especially that go to boot camps or learn from courses like that, or the new courses, will learn a framework before they learn the intricacies of JavaScript. That's fine. Like, it's not the end of the world. You'll probably have to go back at some point and learn some of the fundamentals anyway to, again, solve those more complex problems. As soon as you hit an issue, if you don't have the baseline fundamental understanding of what's JavaScript and what's the framework, that issue will be 10x harder for you than if you did.
It reminds me actually of, I mean, this was not JavaScript, but when we were in college, Mike, they kind of just assumed that we had understood the fundamentals of programming, and they kind of threw us into embedded programming on like a small chip. Now, I'm not going to get into all the intricacies of that, but the point is, there were a lot of people in our class that did not do any programming in high school. It was not a requirement or a prerequisite in any way to joining the program in college. And so they're like, what's a variable? Like, what's a conditional statement? What's an if statement? What is all this?
Yeah, myself included. That was me.
Oh, so like, there you go. And it's like, that's like, you're being thrown into like, hey, like go just start programming some embedded stuff. And like, to me, I understood like, oh, okay, these are conditional statements. You know, these are this, these are that. These are loops. I understand this generally. And we kind of went along with it. And in high school, I had actually learned multiple languages to prove that these concepts translate to most, if not all, programming languages. Whereas, you know, if you had never done it before and you get thrown into embedded programming, you may just start like hard memorizing the syntax. And then you just realize like, oh my God, like I didn't even realize that these concepts are common. So now not only have I been thrown into the deep end, if I have to go and program a different chip in a different language, I still don't know the fundamentals. I gotta go back and learn the fundamentals again. And that's a mess. Like, that's not good. So learn, like, again, JavaScript, vanilla JavaScript, absolutely. One of the pillars, 100%. Mike, I actually have a question for you for like those college days. Like, how was that for you?
Yeah, that first class that we had that assumed knowledge, I got screwed, right? Like, I just didn't understand anything, and I was never taught anything. Like, imagine going into programming without any fundamental knowledge, and then being told that you also won't program in that class, and then being asked to program. So, like, that was a disaster. I didn't fail the class because obviously not the whole class was about programming, and I understood the other parts really well. But that was a good wake-up call that, first of all, life's unfair. And second of all, I got to learn programming. So after that, any other class that came up that had programming in it, I was sitting on my ass learning how to program, even if they said you're not going to have to know how to program. So it was a good wake-up call, good slap in the face. I look back on it and laugh, but at the time, disaster.
Well, disaster because you're paying for the college, but also, like, you mentioned something there, Mike, and that was like, our teacher constantly said, you don't code in this class. And in fact, he said something along the lines of, no one codes. Everyone just takes code that other people have written and modifies it for their use cases. We fought with him tooth and nail saying like, hey, you know, clearly, like, people are coding stuff. Like, there's no LLMs at this point. There's no AI, you know, doing it for us or something. People code. And he's like, no, people don't code. And he's like, and you don't code in this class. And then the test was like, code this up, like code up this function, and you can't use any resources. And it's like, what the hell's going on? And I will say this is like, I was a bit of a wimpy kid back then. There'd be some words that in the class, it'd be a bit of a blow up. Be like, hey, what's going on here? Like, I'm not saying I'm gonna like jump and attack the teacher, but I'd certainly be like, hey, what's going on? What's it say? What's it say here? Is it code up? And isn't your motto like, we don't code? What's that about there, bud? I'm not gonna give all the teacher's name, but boy, oh boy, would there be something. He was pretty powerful in the college though, so I don't know if that would have been good, but I mean, I probably would have did it. The heck with it. Especially if I was paying for it. Like, holy crap. Whee! Especially these days. I'm getting old, getting tired, getting cranky. Well, I said learning, and I've, you know, kind of covered that, but under the same category, debugging. So debugging your teachers and when calling them out for when they do stupid things. No, No, when it comes to debugging, you may suspect that your framework is suffering from a bug. You go through all these troubleshooting options, you're trying things out, you're trying to get this thing to work, and you're like, you know what? Something's going wrong here. Like, I don't think this framework has a bug, or more commonly, I'm misinterpreting how this framework does this. Like, I've used this framework time and time again to do this, but I'm using this function of this framework in such a specific way that maybe I'm actually misinterpreting how it's outputting things, and it's just worked for me in my more liberal cases in the past, and it's not working for me right now. So you've exhausted all your troubleshooting options. You don't know what to do. Well, vanilla JavaScript can come to the rescue here. This helps you specifically and particularly interact with APIs of your choosing, like web APIs of your choosing. You go in there and you go, I want to mess around with that drag and drop API. I want to mess around with that. You can use methods. Go in there and be like, all right, like, I'm going to use this method and get this fixed. I'm going to use this method and, like, try this out, try that out. And by method, I mean like actual JavaScript methods, but methods as well, meaning your workflow. Like, you can go in, again, you're no longer working on the abstracted layer, and you can specifically and particularly meticulously code out what it is to kind of work around this bug, and maybe you'll find out you were misinterpreting something that JavaScript does. You may find it in a particular spot in your code, like, oh, line 7's all messed up. Why is the output all messed up? Oh, I didn't know JavaScript did that. Okay, something like that. A common one would be that JavaScript is not typed without TypeScript, and you may be concatenating instead of adding numbers or something like that. Very, very common. Things like that, where you make a mistake like that. And I mean, the framework's abstracting everything away, so you may not have realized that originally, and now you just learned some theory, right? Because like I said, yeah, learn the pillars, learn JavaScript, but you're not going to remember, let alone do and learn every single bit of JavaScript. Like, that's crazy. You're never going to learn all that. The next thing I have here is reducing dependencies, avoiding framework bloat. So frameworks take up space. Makes sense. I mean, it's something on a computer, it takes up space. So if you don't use like a framework, you won't have that in your bundle on your website, and therefore your actual package size may be smaller. This also takes the form, though, of when things get compiled. So like I mentioned, frameworks are very general. And when they're general, when you compile them, they may not compile it to the most efficient version of the JavaScript. There may be a reason why they can't use the most efficient, meaning size-wise, storage-wise. There may be a reason why it can't use the most efficient, storage method or something like that, because they're looking out for another use case somewhere. And if that is the case, I mean, no problem. Like, all you need to do is potentially get rid of the framework and do a bit of vanilla JavaScript in those cases. You may be like, I don't want that extra package size. I can't afford the storage, or I don't want the storage, or maybe you're challenging yourself to make a super small website or something like that. Again, those very, very specific and restrictive parameters, you may be like, I want to make this bundle extremely, extremely small. Not having a framework is one way to do that. And when you use a framework, they'll often have dependencies. So things that they depend on, like other frameworks or other NPM packages or whatever, other plugins, other tools, other this, other that, other snippets. And both the dependencies and the framework will need to update from time to time. Your project will have the framework as a dependency. So let me lay this out. So the framework itself has dependencies. So let's just say you use Matt's framework. Matt's framework depends on Mike's framework for its typography handling. There you go. So Matt relies on Mike. Fantastic. So then you decide, I'm going to make niche site. That's my project, niche site. Well, if niche site decides to use Matt's framework, not only is now niche site has a dependency of Matt's framework depends on Mike's framework. You see this chain that we're creating here? Now, this isn't like I'm saying like, hey, you use JavaScript all the time, vanilla. Like use vanilla, use vanilla, use vanilla. Things are complex on the web, on mobile apps, whatever. They're complex. And, there's going to be dependencies and a lot of moving parts and a lot of our programs, websites, and all that stuff. That's not what I'm saying. However, if you are trying to reduce dependencies, if you are trying to reduce this bloat, then absolutely try to do it in vanilla JavaScript. It might be not that bad. Mike mentioned familiarity. A number one thing that some people will do is they're like, oh, you know what? I'll download another thing that will like make my bundle even smaller. It's like, or you could have just used the platform. It may have even been smaller to begin with, right? So if you're trying to do this, if you're trying to reduce your dependencies, you're trying to avoid framework. Let's keep saying framework now. Framework bloat. This may be a reason for you to use vanilla JavaScript. And I've already mentioned this, but frameworks are versatile tools. They can do a lot. And if you aren't using a lot of its features, the rest is essentially bloat. I've mentioned bloat a couple times in your project. So now you're bloating up your project, and you might be using one thing. You might be using, I don't want to do like vanilla Ajax calls. I don't want to do that. It's kind of not the nicest. Like it kind of looks like not the greatest and stuff. So it's like, I don't want to do that. I want to, just use a framework's version of Ajax. But there's 1,000 features in this framework. So great. So now you've installed this just for Ajax and there's 999 features not being used. Like, really? And of course, when you're compiling down, obviously the framework's not dumping all these features into your project, but there may be some bloat in there. And also when you're uploading it to GitHub and doing this and that, like there may be some bloat in there where like you're doing things with extra lines of code to make sure that it interacts or interfaces with that framework in such a way, right? And they've done it that way to appeal to a generally wide audience when you could have just done an Ajax call on the native platform. And I kind of loosely, like just kind of, if you're not really getting what I'm saying with this bloat, is if you're a person that only sends some SMS here and there, a text message here and there, why buy a smartphone that's top of the line? Why would you buy something that has an amazing camera, an amazing processor, lots of RAM, lots of storage, lots of this and that for media and games and all kinds of other apps? Why do that? Why wouldn't you just buy a simple phone to send the odd SMS? That's kind of the sum up, I would say, of this. Avoid that bloat if you can. The next one here, and this is something I'm sure Mike and I will talk about because we talked about a little bit at the end of the episode here, and that is legacy browser support. So JavaScript updates over time. We don't really see it. It's not like an app where we go and we click update, but JavaScript does update over time. ES5, now it's ES6, etc., whatever, blah, blah, blah. ES6 plus, whatever we're on right now, it's updates is the point is. And adding new features and syntax comes with the territory of these updates, of course. But this may also leave legacy browsers behind. So we have a problem now where if an enterprise, like a huge enterprise, is like, we need and I'm making this number up, the 0.4% of users that use Internet Explorer, we need those users. We must have them. I need those customers. Well, great. So I guess you're not using any like super modern JavaScript. I guess you're using JavaScript from, X amount of years ago because JavaScript's not going to understand it. Now, there are tools to help you here, right? Such as Babel. And Babel can help you convert modern JavaScript syntax into, a form that's compatible with other browsers. It'll transpile, for example, ES6 plus code into ES5, right? And then that will then work with Internet Explorer. But there's something else I want to be said here is you're thinking like, well, why wouldn't I just code up in whatever I want and do it with Babel? Again, Babel is a tool. And if you have a very specific set of requirements, you may need to really get down into the nitty gritty. And so you may need to write your own ES5 vanilla JavaScript. ES5 meaning that's like the version, the update, you can think of it as. And that's the one that works with Internet Explorer. I don't know which versions of Internet Explorer, but likely the latest one. But regardless of which, things like that. Also, you can control what you use. So at a really easy level, var used to be the way to declare variables, and it still is, and you could totally still use it. But the more modern way is to use a let or a const in various contexts. Something like Internet Explorer, especially an older version, is not going to know what a let is. And it's not going to know what a const is. So you can actually just say, the heck with this, in my own code, I'm not going to transpile, I'm not going to use a tool. I'm going to use var right from the start.
So I honestly think this one is more of a feature of a framework versus a reason to use vanilla JavaScript, and I'll explain. Setting up Babel, for example, on your own with your own package manager and like getting the the build process to work for Babel like Babel is essentially a layer that compiles your code, your JavaScript into a different subset of JavaScript. It's the same thing as like TypeScript compiling to JavaScript. Babel is another one of those layers, and you have to set it up in the same kind of way. Frameworks actually do that from you from the get-go, from the start. And so it allows you to skip the step of setting it up. So for me, if I was worried about compiling or working on many different browsers, I'd actually rather use a framework that takes care of that part for me rather than sticking around and trying to figure it out. Or for example, like Matt said, using vars instead of let and const. That would be the last, like that would be a reason not to use JavaScript in my opinion, because when you're going back to using old JavaScript just for the sake of using old JavaScript, you're kind of hindering yourself from what you can do. And if you're not leaning on the new tools, you're also not learning the new tools. So therefore, it's kind of putting you back a step. I don't know. This one specifically out of all the ones, which I would put in the column of use a framework to do this better.
And that's a perfect example of like, these aren't airtight, reasons, like unless you have a specific parameter of your project that requires you to write ES5, right? Or, God knows what, ES4, whatever. I've only really heard of ES5 and ES6, to be honest, and 6 plus. I guess like I assume the older version was ES4. Like, why learn the old syntax? You're just going to start confusing yourself, and you're almost like stepping into a world of like, the var example is really easy. Like, that's easy enough to remember. But there's so many other little things that you might be like, oh my God. And then also you might accidentally be trying to change CSS that like is incompatible as well. So now you're like trying to, which you'll have to deal with yourself, but you're going to have to try to like, I don't even know what the heck you'd have to do. You'd have to like learn ES5 while remembering that this is only for right now, and then like try to make sure that the CSS you're using and manipulating with JavaScript is like, you can see the layers already uncovering. So Mike's like, right, like this may be something that you may want to like use a tool, and this mention is extremely niche. The next one here, unless you had something to add there, Mike, so I reach for your microphone. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, I can probably do the next one since I'm the one that wrote it. And I believe this one is very, very, very pertinent towards using JavaScript because I use it all the time for this specific thing. And Matt already mentioned it a little bit. So prototyping and proof of concept. This is something where you just need to quickly write a piece of code to see if it'll work. A lot of times I do this on a particular website that, hey, I wonder if I can scrape this website and find a bunch of similar articles or find a bunch of similar divs that I can kind of group together, whatever. Something where I need to do something on a specific website. I will go into the console of the dev tools on that website, and I will literally write JavaScript code directly in the console of that website. And you don't have to write website specific code there. You can actually use that as like a JavaScript runtime environment and write whatever you want. Like you can do a calculation there. You can do anything. You can have it output into a console. You can have it output into an alert. You can even have it change something on that page. So you can do it, a document.getElement by ID and have it actually like change something directly on that page just to prove a concept, right? So I find this to be really great for just, again, trying stuff out, not having to spin up my IDE really quickly or spin up a framework, for example, just to quickly try out a calculation. That doesn't make any sense. Quickly jumping into any website's console and running some code, really awesome. The other thing that you can do, and I've done many times, and I've even shared this on social media and on HTML Things website, is just a quick code pen, right? Code pens a lot of times are just pure HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now you can do some frameworky things and package things, but typically they're really just JavaScript. And to illustrate a concept like, hey, how do you do this array reduce method properly? How do you do this really interesting way of, highlighting a canvas and adding some stuff to the canvas, maybe making a little game? A lot of times a code pen, which is just JavaScript usually, is a great way to give that example. Rather than showing a user how to spin up an entire framework, just to provide an example of a piece of code, it's much easier to have a little code pen or a JS Fiddle or Replit, whatever, that has just pure JavaScript, because it boils it down, it removes all the layers, and it just shows you exactly what you're trying to show. So showing a proof of concept, sharing a feature, prototyping inside of JavaScript is really fun. In fact, like I like JavaScript for that, because it's a really easy language to just quickly write stuff in. People really hate JavaScript for that because, again, it doesn't have strong types. It's kind of like really loosey-goosey, but for really quickly prototyping something, there's not much better. Python could be arguably better, but can you open up a browser and start writing Python? No. You need to get a Python environment going, and then you can start writing Python. The fact that you can just jump into a browser, open up DevTools, and go into the console and start writing code on any device, I think that's a huge bonus.
This is and it's highly related. This is what a lot of people will do if they're like web designers and they know enough HTML and CSS to be dangerous, let's say. And I mean vanilla, well, I guess vanilla HTML, CSS, but not using a framework or some sort of building platform. They're actually like coding it up. I know a lot of them will, and they'll mention this on X and things like that, where they will quickly actually prototype and quickly get together even like really basic wireframes or really basic, I guess, like literally like functioning to a degree prototypes with HTML and CSS that have like the responsive design built in really nice. So that users can see that, and the buttons don't work necessarily and things like that. However, this is like an example of that, right? Where like someone who knows JavaScript really well, or at least enough to be dangerous, can quickly prototype, quickly make things work. And so if you know all three pillars decently, you could actually very quickly get a proof of concept up and running. And the last thing here for the day. I don't know why it was like such a grand thing, but anyway, last thing here for the day is adding to a platform. So this is something really quick. I'm not going to like dive too deep into this, but what this is this is something like if you're using a platform such as a CMS that has an embed, hey, embed your own custom code here. Most of the time, compiled JavaScript is not supported here. Like it's not like, hey, type your React code here and we'll make sure to, compile it for you and then just like paste the JavaScript into this box for you. Like that's not what happens. So a lot of the times also you don't have a use case that's worth doing that either. Usually it's something like kind of small. Like usually it's something like, this one button, like, I can only add a drop shadow. I can't customize it in this platform for some reason, but I want it to be just a little darker. Well, you can do that in CSS. You can do that with JavaScript. So in this case, I'll go in and use like the JavaScript box and I'll quickly add some custom code to make the JavaScript, adjust it whenever you're hovering or something along those lines. And I mentioned CSS already. This is one of the reasons why knowing the three pillars, including vanilla JavaScript, is so important, because these things go hand in hand. Hey, can I approach this with vanilla CSS in this custom code box? Hey, can I approach this with JavaScript in this custom code box? Those are great tools to have. And of course, because it's the native platform, a lot of these platforms, like the CMSs and that, no-code tools is another great example, where they just allow you to embed your own code. 99% of the time, it's just like, embed your own code. So it's like, I'll add my own little bit of HTML, a little bit of CSS, a little bit of JavaScript. And if you don't have an element for me, like a click and drag and drop an element onto the canvas, onto the page, you don't have that element for me, I'll make my own really quick. I'll just do that with a little bit of this vanilla stuff and boom, like there you go. There seems to be like this thought sometimes that vanilla HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are limited in some way. And that's just not true. As we've talked about today, JavaScript from a framework, from any other tool, is compiled down to vanilla JavaScript because the platform only understands these three pillars. And so having vanilla JavaScript and using vanilla JavaScript or excuse me, having the knowledge of vanilla JavaScript allows you to use vanilla JavaScript to extend these no-code tools and these various site building tools. This is a great way to add little bits of features to things like a WordPress site that has a page builder built in, to add to, let's say, a Webflow site, add to a Wix site, add to a Squarespace site, enter in all these other site builders that exist out in the waste. For some reason, I talk like a Fallout character there, but anyway, out in the wasteland, I'll just stick with it. But you can now be like, hey, instead of us saying, you know what, shoot, I can't make this page work the way the client wants, we're going to have to change platforms. No, you won't need to change platforms. Just add a bit of that, extend the capabilities of it. And in some cases, as your projects are scaling up, maybe they're getting to the point where they're going to need like an enterprise level solution. You can extend the life of these tools a little bit with your 3 pillars knowledge. You can go in and be like, okay, I can make these custom pages. I'll make them work. It'll continue to work in this while we transition and things like that. Or, oh, you know what? Like, no problem. I can do a quick fix. Or, I can't find that. Like, one of my famous things that I despise this about WordPress sometimes is that there'll be several settings menus. So sometimes the plugin will add a setting to the WordPress settings menu. Other times it'll have it in its own settings menu. And sometimes it'll be in multiple places. Disaster zone. I know, like, where is the background color? This has to be done today. Well, a quick fix might be a little bit of that custom CSS, a little bit of that custom JS, and they'll be vanilla, right? I'm not writing Sass. I'm not writing React. I'm doing vanilla stuff. And that, to bring that professional angle back in, that is absolutely something that I do literally right now, every day professionally. So having that knowledge is, to me, extremely critical and quite literally pays my bills. Because yes, I understand, like, oh, you should know React, you should do this and that. Vanilla JavaScript in 2025 is not dead. I just listed a bunch of reasons, and adding to a platform is likely in 2025, at least in my experience, the most relevant thing. Because platforms, especially if you work at an agency, are extremely valuable. And you don't want to throw a whole platform away just because one random element doesn't exist in the platform, or one little way of styling or one little way of interactivity does not exist in the platform. Extend those platforms with the vanilla, get nice, hopefully some really nice performant code going. And exercise your 3 pillars. Like, why the heck not? Exercise those skills. But that's it. I think that concludes this episode, unless, Mike, you have anything else to add.
No, I think this was a solid episode, and I totally agree with you that learning those skills is going to benefit you exponentially in the future. Again, not a requirement, and everything we said was a caveat, but it's going to help.
100%. Absolutely. Again, learn your 3 pillars. I've said it over and over again. I have 3 episodes where I've covered little different things. So just kind of like a look at the 3 pillars, HTML, CSS, JavaScript. I don't know if the CSS one is out right now. You may see it in the feed again. This release order has been kind of jumbled a little bit in comparison to when we recorded it. But I have sort of different looks at different concepts within the 3 pillars. And like, it's not a big overview or anything like that, but little interesting things such as semantic HTML and things like that. So I'll if I remember, I'll put those links to the sort of trio of episodes in the show notes here. If you want to check them out on htmlallthethings.com, go check that out. And if you want to support episodes like this, remember you can do so on Patreon. That is patreon.com/HTML. All the things, and many thanks to our $3 tier patrons. Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com. Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com. Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com. Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se. Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server. And Stacy Mosteler from swoonworthydesigns.com. And just a very quick reminder that we have a deal going on with Magic Mind. Get up to 45% off the Magic Mind bundle. That includes the mental performance shot as well as Magic Mind Sleep using my link, magicmind.com/HTMLPodBJan. That's HTMLPodBJAN. Go check it out at that link in the show description. And of course, in the show notes, you can check it out there if your podcast player does not support hyperlinks in the show description. And last but not least, we'd like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on HTMLAllTheThings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.